Hello there, my name is Phil Suttle and I run Suttle Economics, a macroeconomic research firm. I just put out a new note to my client on the topic of the interest sensitivity on the US economy. I think this is a very important and relevant topic, especially in the context of I think a sort of growing perception that the Fed has raised interest rates a lot, but it doesn't seem to be working to slow the economy quite as much as expected. When I look and think about this topic, I think the first place to start is to kind of ask yourself, well, what should be happening? And one way to address that topic is to use a macroeconomic model. And I looked at the Fed's FRB US model and the ready reckoners that they provide to look at what effect the impact that the Fed's tightening to date should have been having on the economy. In the first slide, what you can see is what the Fed model tells us about the effect that a 1 percentage point rise in the Fed funds rate should have on GDP, on economic activity. And what the chart shows you is that 1% on the Fed funds rate takes about a 0.5 percentage point off growth, with the maximum effect being felt after 7 quarters. In the second slide, what you can see is how the performance of interest rate sensitive spending has actually evolved over the past couple of years, looked at in a longer term perspective. And you can actually see there has been a very appreciable slowing in the growth contribution from these interest sensitive sectors. In fact, it matches even mild recession periods in the past, including, for example, 2001. So certainly interest rate effects have bitten. In fact, the anomaly, if there is one statistically here, would seem to be between the relationship of interest sensitive spending and the unemployment rate. And it's the lack of labour market deterioration rather than overall demand growth deterioration that stands out as most notable. And in fact, if we pull these two charts together and combine the blue line from chart 1, what should have happened, with the blue line from chart 2, what actually has happened, and line them up, which is what I do in chart 3, somewhat arbitrarily, I admit, but kind of overlay one on the other, you can see that the path of what's actually happening doesn't look out of line with what should be happening, at least as far as interest-sensitive spending is concerned. What's important to emphasize, of course, is that we've only had part of the progress to date, and we've got at least a year or so of further deterioration in actual spending growth before we hit the trough. And that's assuming that Fed policy is close to its peak of tightness. Now, of course, the real world is never as smooth as the model world, and there are some factors getting in the way of smooth adjustment. And I think many of them tend to lean in the direction of giving us a bit less response from the economy, from demand in the economy, to higher interest rates. And let me just conclude this little message with 3 examples of that. First, if you look at chart 4, you can see that there's been this kind of real paradox in the past year or so, which is that auto loan interest rates have risen sharply, which is the decline of the red line in chart 4. That's an inverse scale on the right scale. But that's occurred at the same time that auto sales have actually jumped quite substantially. Now, of course, that's not a case of higher rates generating higher sales. It's higher sales despite higher rates. And those higher sales are an example of the alleviation of some of the supply shortages that we had in 2021 and early 22. A second example of the lack of sort of interest rate impact on demand comes from the fact that partly because of these shortages that we had for so long, we have a relatively low level of inventory of goods across the economy. So as interest rates go up and restrain inventory demand, that effect is checked by the fact that inventories start off quite low. And I'd make this point not just about goods in the manufacturing, wholesale and retail sectors, but also, for example, about the state of the housing market. The low level of inventory in housing means that there's a problem in trying to get higher rates to bite on housing demand. And finally, when you look at the corporate sector and the demand for fixed assets from businesses, there are a whole series of things kind of getting in the way there, including some significant fiscal actions. The infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is promoting investment in green technologies, and the more recent CHIPS Act, which is boosting the semiconductor sector. And in addition, I think there's an important effect from the fact that just corporates have been much less willing to borrow to finance expansion over the last decade. And that's shown up in chart 6 in a financing gap for the corporate sector that really since 2015-16 has actually been a general surplus. So the corporate sector has been lending to the rest of the economy rather than borrowing from it. And that obviously means that higher rates have a pretty different effect on corporate fortunes than they used to, for example, in the late 1990s. Well, I hope you find these points and charts interesting. Of course, there's a lot more detail and analysis in the note itself. And if you'd like to read the full note, and more importantly, see more of what I do at Subtle Economics, here's the way to sign up for a free trial.